Hollywood loves a rebel until that rebel starts questioning the system itself. You think being blacklisted was all about scandal and sleaze? Think again. Behind the glitz, some of the most legendary stars were secretly erased, not for what they did, but for what they believed. What happens when your convictions put you on a studio's hit list? Stick around, because some of the names on this list will make you rethink everything you know about old Hollywood power. John Garfield. John Garfield was Hollywood's ultimate tough guy. On screen, he radiated grit and vulnerability in a way that rewrote the rules for American leading men. But off-screen, Garfield waged a different kind of battle, one that would cost him everything. He came from poverty in New York's Lower East Side, clawed his way up through the theater world, and took Tinseltown by storm with roles in Body and Soul and The Postman Always Rings Twice. Critics adored him, audiences flocked to see him. He was the real deal. So what destroyed his career? Not drugs, not affairs, but beliefs, dangerous ones, if you were a studio boss in the 1950s. Garfield was passionate about workers' rights. He spoke out for the underdog, supported unions, and lent his name to progressive causes at a time when that could get you branded a traitor. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, wanted him to name names, to betray colleagues suspected of communist leanings. Garfield refused. He would not sell out his friends or his conscience. The cost? Studios stopped calling. His name disappeared from the marquee lights. Friends vanished. Even as his health failed under the pressure, Hollywood kept him in exile, too risky to touch. Garfield died of a heart attack at 39, a casualty, not of his own vices, but of a political witch hunt. Ironically, he was never a member of the Communist Party. He was guilty of only one thing: sticking to his principles in an industry that rewarded submission. In the end, Hollywood's ultimate tough guy became its ultimate martyr. Edward G. Robinson. You know that snarl, the voice, the stare, the finger jab? That's Edward G. Robinson, the guy who defined gangster cool in classics like Little Caesar and Key Largo. At his peak, Robinson was box office gold, pulling in crowds and critical praise with ease. But in a town that rewards conformity, Robinson's real-life convictions proved more dangerous than any on-screen crime. Robinson was a rare breed, an actor who believed in something bigger than himself. He publicly fought against fascism, denounced Nazis before it was trendy, and championed civil rights in a segregated America. In the 30s and 40s, he put his money and reputation where his mouth was, donating to dozens of progressive and anti-fascist groups. When the war ended and the Red Scare hit, all that good work became a liability. Suddenly, charity events and anti-Nazi speeches were twisted into subversive activity. Robinson was called before HUAC and grilled about his loyalties, his friends, and his donations. Desperate to clear his name, Robinson testified, insisting he had nothing to hide. But the damage was done. Studios grew cold, leading roles dried up. The actor who once ruled the screen was relegated to supporting parts, his former power now a shadow. No official blacklist ever named him, but Robinson's career was crippled by a silent ban. In private, he was gutted, famously saying, "I didn't name names, but I did everything else. They broke my heart." Robinson's story is the ultimate Hollywood gut punch. Beloved one decade, ghosted the next, all for believing that art and activism could mix. He may have survived the blacklist, but Hollywood never forgave him for challenging the script. Zero Mostel, the genius who laughed in the face of fear. If you thought blacklisting killed careers quietly, you've never met Zero Mostel. Mostel wasn't just a performer, he was a force of nature, a tornado in a 10-gallon hat. In a Hollywood built on playing it safe, Mostel was the guy who made chaos into an art form, on stage, on film, and in life. Audiences adored his wild comic energy in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum and The Producers. But for a while, the only laughs he got were behind closed doors. Why? Because Zero Mostel refused to betray his principles, no matter the cost. During the early 1950s, when the House Un-American Activities Committee came knocking, Mostel could have taken the easy way out. He could have named names, recited the party line, played the game. Instead, he turned the whole charade into a comedy routine, sarcastic, uncooperative, infuriating to the investigators. His reward? A near-total Hollywood exile. Studios canceled contracts, TV networks hung up the phone, and even Broadway became a minefield. Did Mostel back down? Not a chance. He painted, he performed underground, he even worked as a nightclub comic, never losing his fire. The Blacklist nearly broke him, but when the cultural tides shifted, he roared back in. His later performances were funnier, angrier, and more human because they came from someone who'd stared Hollywood power in the face and laughed. The lesson? Zero Mostel wasn't destroyed by the Blacklist, he used it as material. His refusal to submit didn't just save his soul, it turned him into a living legend. If you're looking for a hero who punched back, look no further. Hollywood tried to bury him. Instead, he made them the punchline. Lillian Hellman. In a town obsessed with happy endings, Lillian Hellman was a living, breathing plot twist. Playwright, screenwriter, firebrand, Hellman was one of the sharpest pens and sharpest tongues Hollywood ever saw. She wrote classics like The Little Foxes and The Children's Hour, pushing boundaries with fierce, unapologetic commentary on injustice. But it was her real life that turned into the kind of drama you can't make up. Hellman's troubles began when her political activism, fighting for unions, supporting civil rights, calling out fascists, put her on the wrong side of the post-war panic. She was summoned before the House Un-American Activities Committee, demanded to denounce her friends and rewrite history to fit the latest political fashion. Hellman's response? A letter so iconic it could have been a scene in a noir thriller. I cannot and will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions. That defiance wasn't just talk. Hollywood quietly shut her out. Studios blacklisted her, producers yanked her credits, and projects she'd sweated over were erased or handed to more acceptable writers. For years, Hellman scraped by, blackballed by the system she once enriched. Did she give up? Not a chance. Hellman doubled down, writing memoirs that roasted her enemies and cemented her legend. She outlasted most of the men who tried to silence her, eventually returning to acclaim, but only after losing the prime years of her film career. In an era where even the toughest caved, Hellman stayed unbreakable. Her conscience cost her everything, except her place in history. Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson wasn't just an actor, he was a phenomenon. Singer, scholar, athlete, international superstar, Robeson had more talent in his little finger than most stars had in their entire bodies. His deep, thunderous voice shook concert halls from Harlem to Moscow. But it was that same voice, raised for justice, that got him blacklisted at the very height of his career. In an America obsessed with conformity, Robeson did the unthinkable. He spoke out against racism, colonialism, and most scandalously, he expressed admiration for the Soviet Union at a time when the U.S. was consumed by Cold War paranoia. He campaigned for civil rights, championed labor, and called out the hypocrisy of American democracy. To Hollywood's studio chiefs and Washington's power brokers, Robeson was dangerous, too famous, too outspoken, too unwilling to play the grateful entertainer. The result? An unofficial, devastating blacklist. Robeson's films were pulled from circulation, his concerts were canceled, even his passport was revoked, effectively trapping him in the U.S. and crushing his international career. Venues closed their doors, sponsors disappeared, and the media painted him as a menace, all for speaking out. It was character assassination on a global scale. Robeson didn't go quietly. He kept fighting, singing and organizing, even as opportunities evaporated. But the toll was immense. Once a household name, he became a cautionary tale whispered in studio corridors. The system tried to erase him, but history remembers Paul Robeson not as a threat, but as a titan who used his gifts for a higher purpose. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin, the bowler hat, The cane, the walk, was the most famous man on earth. He could make the world laugh without saying a word. But when Chaplin finally did speak, it wasn't what Hollywood wanted to hear. Here's the twist. Chaplin's greatest crime wasn't in his personal life or even his on-screen antics. It was his stubborn refusal to fit into any box, political or moral. By the 1940s, Chaplin's internationalism and open criticism of fascism set him apart. He funded anti-Nazi films, spoke out for the working poor, and publicly called for peace with the Soviet Union when most stars were waving flags and selling war bonds. That kind of talk was enough to make J. Edgar Hoover's blood boil. As the Red Scare ignited, Chaplin became a living target. Rumors spread. Was he a communist? A sexual deviant? Just un-American? Chaplin didn't help his own case, dropping bombs like "I am not a citizen of any country" and making Monsieur Verdoux, a black comedy about capitalism itself. The press went wild. HUAC came sniffing. The FBI kept a 2,000-page file on him. Studios started treating Chaplin like radioactive waste. Then, in 1952, on a trip to London, the U.S. revoked his re-entry permit. He was, literally, locked out of the country he'd made laugh. Chaplin's exile was a Hollywood first, a silent legend silenced not by scandal, but by beliefs deemed too radical, too inconvenient. Sure, he worked again. Sure, he got an honorary Oscar decades later, but by then, the little tramp was a ghost in the system, his voice a warning. Make Hollywood laugh, but never make it nervous. Burgess Meredith. Burgess Meredith is one of those actors whose face you know, even if you can't always place his name. Rocky's crusty coach? That's him. The original Penguin in Batman? Yep. But before he was dishing out tough love or waddling with a top hat, Meredith was one of Hollywood's most promising chameleons. He could do drama, comedy, stage, or screen. He had range, grit, and undeniable charm. But in the 1950s, range didn't protect you from the blacklist. Meredith's sin? Lending his talents to progressive theater and leftist activism. His name popped up in Red Channels, the notorious pamphlet that was Hollywood's unofficial blacklist. No trial, no hearing, just quiet career destruction. Suddenly, casting calls dried up. Studios crossed his name off projects. The phone, once always ringing, went dead. Here's the kicker. Meredith wasn't just blacklisted for what he did. He was blacklisted for who he refused to betray. He wouldn't name names or denounce colleagues to HUAC, even under pressure. That silent defiance cost him dearly. He went from star to persona non grata almost overnight. Did it break him? Not a chance. Meredith took his talents to Broadway and European films, waiting out the storm. When the blacklist finally faded, he stormed back, racking up Oscar nominations and a new legion of fans. But Hollywood's message was clear. Cross the invisible line and even the best can find themselves in the wilderness. Meredith survived. Many others never got the chance. Gale Sondergaard. Before Hollywood ever heard of Meryl Streep or Viola Davis, there was Gale Sondergaard, a trailblazer and a powerhouse, the first woman to win the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. She was elegant, commanding, and unafraid to play villains or complicated women when most actresses were stuck in the dutiful wife rut. But what really made Sondergaard dangerous to the system? She believed in standing by her principles, even if it cost her everything. Her troubles started with her marriage to Herbert Biberman, one of the infamous Hollywood 10 writers and directors who refused to testify before HUAC. Instead of distancing herself, Sondergaard stood firmly by his side, refusing to grovel or recant. The studio bosses did not appreciate the loyalty. It was guilt by association at its most brutal. Suddenly, her roles vanished. She was dropped from the letter days before filming, her name scrubbed from studio rosters. Sondergaard tried to fight back, even testifying before Congress. But the blacklist was relentless. She found herself locked out of Hollywood, forced to work in regional theater and tiny venues just to keep her craft alive. Decades passed before she was welcomed back. By then, Hollywood had forgotten her glory. Her story is the ultimate test of character. Would you trade everything, fame, fortune, even your legacy, to stand by your beliefs? Sondergaard did, and paid the price. Yet history remembers her as a rebel who stood tall, while her censors faded into footnotes. Howard da Silva. Howard da Silva was the guy you'd spot in 100 films and never forget. A powerhouse character actor with a face made for playing rogues, rebels, and working-class firebrands. On screen, he could light up a room or darken it in a flash. But in real life, da Silva's greatest crime wasn't a role he played, but a stand he took. As a passionate union activist, da Silva was on the front lines of every major fight for artists' rights in Hollywood. He was loud, proud, and impossible to intimidate. The industry bosses didn't like a man who spoke up, especially as the Cold War paranoia crept in. His outspokenness and his willingness to speak up for leftist causes put a target on his back. When HUAC rolled into Hollywood, da Silva didn't play their game. He refused to recant, refused to point fingers, refused to perform the ritual of public confession. That defiance came at a steep cost. Studios pulled him from films, his name was erased from credits, and he was unceremoniously dumped from the 1951 musical South Pacific, despite having already recorded the soundtrack. His scenes were reshot, his voice dubbed over, as if he'd never existed. The industry was erasing him in real time. Da Silva was forced to retreat to Broadway and off-the-radar productions, but the blacklist never broke him. When the winds shifted and the Hollywood blacklist thawed, da Silva bounced back, scoring an Oscar nomination for The Great Gatsby and a Tony win for Fiorello. But those lost years, they were the price he paid for speaking up, for refusing to play it safe. In the end, da Silva's story is Hollywood's story, glamorous on the surface, but ruthless when threatened by independent minds. They tried to erase his voice. All they did was make it louder. 10. Lionel Stander. Lionel Stander was not the kind of actor who took orders, on screen or off. With his unmistakable Brooklyn growl and rough-edged charm, he stole scenes in films like Mr. Deeds Goes to Town and A Star is Born. But if you really wanted fireworks, you had to see Stander off-set, taking on anyone he thought was corrupt, hypocritical, or just plain stupid. Stander's real-life role as a union man and relentless activist made him a hero to some and a menace to others. He was a founding member of the Screen Actors Guild and never shied away from a fight, especially when it came to standing up for colleagues or blasting Hollywood's culture of fear. So when HUAC summoned him, Stander didn't just refuse to play ball, he tore the whole game down. In open testimony, he called the committee's methods a travesty and their investigation stupid, making headlines and enemies in equal measure. You can guess what happened next. Stander's name landed on every secret blacklist in town. The roles dried up, the invitations vanished, and even friends turned their backs. He was dropped from films, erased from studio lots, and forced into a decade-long exile from major pictures. Unlike some, Stander didn't try to hide or hedge. He became a living symbol of resistance, a man too honest for the Hollywood system. But here's the kicker. Stander outlasted his blacklisters. By the late 1960s, he was back, chewing scenery in everything from European art films to TV's Heart to Heart. The blacklist tried to break him. Instead, it made him iconic, a one-man show of guts and integrity in an industry that preferred obedience. Lionel Stander called out the witch hunt, and history gave him the last word. 11. Dorothy Comingore. Dorothy Comingore should have been a legend. Her performance as Susan Alexander in Citizen Kane was haunting, raw, and unforgettable. Orson Welles picked her out of obscurity, convinced she'd be a breakout star. But Hollywood's welcome mat can turn into a trapdoor with frightening speed, and Comingore's career is a cautionary tale for the ages. Her sin wasn't scandal, addiction, or ego. It was politics. Comingore was active in leftist causes and passionate about civil rights and workers' advocacy. She was vocal, unafraid, and unwilling to play dumb for the cameras. When the Red Scare hit, HUAC zeroed in on her. She was subpoenaed, grilled, and asked to betray friends and colleagues, something she flatly refused to do. In a town built on betrayal, Comingore held her ground. The consequences were brutal. Suddenly, her phone stopped ringing. Studio heads, afraid of the taint, froze her out. She went from starring in what's now called the greatest film ever made to scraping for odd jobs and tiny theater roles. Friends disappeared, scripts vanished, and her once bright future evaporated overnight. The stress, poverty, and public humiliation took their toll. Comingore's career, health, and even family life spiraled. She died largely forgotten, a casualty of an industry that rewarded silence and punished integrity. But for anyone who's watched Citizen Kane and felt the pain behind Susan Alexander's eyes, Dorothy Comingore's real story is just as powerful, a raw reminder of how quickly Hollywood can turn a star into a ghost. 12. Jeff Corey. Jeff Corey wasn't just a gifted actor. He was the kind of character performer who made everyone else look good. In films like Home of the Brave and The Killers, Corey brought a sharp intensity to every role, even if you didn't always know his name. Off-screen, he became even more legendary, not for scandal or excess, but for his stubborn refusal to betray others. When the Red Scare swept through Hollywood, Corey, like so many others, was called before HUAC. They wanted him to name names, to give up colleagues, students, friends. Corey's answer was simple. No, he wouldn't play that game. It wasn't just about principle. Corey believed that an artist's job was to challenge, not conform. "I didn't want to crawl in the mud just to save myself," he said later. That answer cost him dearly. Almost overnight, Corey was blacklisted from every major studio. His phone went dead, the roles disappeared, but rather than retreat into bitterness or anonymity, Corey found a new calling. Teaching. His acting classes in Los Angeles became legendary, shaping the careers of future stars like Jack Nicholson, James Dean, and Jane Fonda. Ironically, Corey ended up influencing Hollywood more in exile than he ever could as a star. Eventually, the blacklist faded, and Corey returned to the screen, older but unbroken, adding gravity and grit to everything from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid to Star Trek. Hollywood lost years of his prime, but Corey's story became a legend in its own right. A reminder that the real rebels aren't always the loudest, but the ones who refuse to let fear write their script. 13. Will Geer. Blacklisted for love and belief. You probably know Will Geer best as the wise, warm Grandpa Walton from TV's The Waltons. But decades before that, Geer's career was derailed not just for his activism, but for something even more taboo in mid-century Hollywood, being openly gay. Geer was a passionate advocate for unions, a frequent presence at labor rallies, and an unapologetic member of progressive political groups. He wasn't afraid to challenge the studio bosses or the status quo. During the Blacklist years, Geer was hit with the double whammy, targeted for leftist beliefs and for living his truth in a time when even whispers about sexuality could destroy a career. He was called before HUAC, refused to recant, and found himself completely frozen out. The studios slammed their doors. No roles, no auditions, no second chances. For years, he survived through theater, folk music, and odd jobs, helping to build the now famous Theatricum Botanicum in Topanga Canyon, a sanctuary for blacklisted artists and freethinkers. But Geer never faded into self-pity. He built community, lifted others, and kept fighting. Decades later, he returned to national fame as Grandpa Walton, finally getting the recognition and the Emmy that Hollywood tried to deny him. Geer's life is a reminder that sometimes surviving with your soul intact is the biggest victory of all. He didn't just outlast the blacklist, he outlived it, proving that conviction can echo louder than any act of erasure. So there you have it, 13 legends who paid the ultimate price for daring to think differently. In a town built on illusion, they challenged the script and refused to betray their beliefs, even when the spotlight vanished. But here's the twist. The blacklist couldn't erase their impact, and history never forgot their courage. Which story hit you the hardest? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe, and share this with someone who loves a good Hollywood plot twist. Who should we expose next?